Remember last year when I put Star Wars Episode 9 The Rise of Skywalker in my favorite 3 Star Wars films of all time?
I mean, this is now on my favorite 3 Star Wars films.
Well, I decided to watch it 2 more times ever since I first saw it in theaters, and now, looking back on it, I don't think it deserves any of the praise that I gave it from before. It really doesn't. I'll start it off with Genie. What do you think of The Rise of Skywalker looking back on it, Genie? Yeah, she's definitely right about that one. Adding to what Genie had to say, I really think the film itself didn't accomplish its goal either. It's definitely no secret that even most of the cast members themselves expressed their dissatisfaction over the sequel trilogy, especially with the way that their respective characters were handled. Even the most vocal about it was John Boyega. He even talked about how his character, Finn, was the most mistreated, especially with the amount of potential we saw in him when he was first introduced in The Force Awakens. He could have had a lot of amazing character, but they just completely threw it in the trash. But what I really want to talk about is why The Force Awakens was the only good film to come from the sequel trilogy. While I'm not trying to defend the sequel trilogy as a whole by any means necessary, I do think that The Force Awakens is a pretty good starting point for what the future would entail, even if it was flawed in some areas. It's just too bad that it was sorely let down by 2 more follow-ups that just failed to live to that promise. Basically, The Force Awakens had what the latter 2 of the sequel trilogy didn't have, and that was potential for the future, especially with what I just talked about before very briefly. Not only that, but it also gave us something more fresh, and not like a full-on rehash from before, unlike the 2 films that followed it. Sure, there were some elements that came out of nowhere, but when you compare it to something like, I don't know, The Last Jedi with its treatment of Luke Skywalker, or even with The Rise of Skywalker with its fan service, it doesn't really do that. And while we're on the subject of old characters, I also want to touch upon how even they were mistreated in the latter part of the sequel trilogy. Despite Han Solo being killed off in The Force Awakens, you would think that even after all this build-up, Luke Skywalker will get almost equal the amount of love and care in The Last Jedi. But no, Rian Johnson decided to completely throw that in the trash. This could have been an emotional arc for Luke Skywalker to go through, because his own nephew, Ben Solo, had turned to the dark side and become Kylo Ren. This could have been a good emotional arc for Luke to rise up again. But no, they just completely bastardized the entire thing. I get you want to focus on new characters, but there are proper ways of approaching it. Take The Mandalorian as an example. The Mandalorian was able to do what The Last Jedi failed to do, and that was to give an emotional justification about why that character couldn't be trained. Ahsoka knew why Grogu couldn't be trained in the ways of the Force, because of his emotional attachment to his parental figure being Din Djarin, aka the Mandalorian. Prior to a redeemed Luke Skywalker after what Rian Johnson did to him, that was something that Ahsoka feared that he would have, because we know what happened with her former master, Anakin Skywalker. The fear of attachments was what led him down to the path of the dark side, and would eventually turn him into Darth Vader. And don't even get me started on how his daughter Leia was handled, both before and after Carrie Fisher died. In fact, while we're on the subject of Anakin Skywalker, I want to talk about how the rise of Skywalker completely undermined his sacrifice in Return of the Jedi. Christ, what can I say about this one? How it should have ended did these 2 films way more justice than the actual films themselves. there was literally no point in bringing Palpatine back for the sequel trilogy. Unlike Darth Maul and Boba Fett, where they had potential and a reason to return, Palpatine had no f***ing reason to return! And no, I'm not buying into the fact, oh, he was a clone. No! There was literally no reason to bring Palpatine back from the dead. All it did was undermine the sacrifice that Anakin Skywalker made in Return of the Jedi. That was the whole point of it. Now they just simply made it look as if it meant nothing. What the hell were they thinking? Overall, both The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker could have been really amazing films. They could have at least given The Force Awakens a decent run for its money. But they sadly weren't. Why? Because there was no clear plan. The first 6 films had a plan. The MCU had a plan. Why? Because it was made ahead of time. Episodes 8 and 9 didn't have that plan. Even if it was, it just wasn't followed correctly. It's definitely no secret that Disney was trying to release Star Wars in the same way the MCU was released. However, here's the thing. Star Wars is not the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yes, it's owned by the same company. Yes, actors and certain alumni have been on both franchises. But how they are and how they're released are two different things. That was, at least you could argue, until the recent announcement from Disney Investors Day, which I'll talk about very briefly at the end. In fact, even Daisy Ridley said on an interview in Jimmy Kimmel Live with guest host Josh Gad that there was no clear direction at all, especially when it came to a character, Rey, and deciding her true parentage was either a Kenobi or a Palpatine, or simply a nobody. So instead, what did they do? They just leaned on to pure nostalgia as a desperate little crutch to move forward because they simply had no f***ing clue about what they were even doing with the characters that they introduced and established in The Force Awakens. The Last Jedi was the tipping point for the franchise, despite the fact there were only 2 good scenes I found from the film, in my opinion, while The Rise of Skywalker couldn't wrap up anything nicely either, and instead did a far worse job ending the series than what Game of Thrones did months earlier. Yes, I'm going there, people. Star Wars Episode 9 was just as bad as the 8th and final season of Game of Thrones. In fact, there's even a podcast that laid out how Episode 9 was originally going to be had they decided to keep Colin Trevorrow and not bring back J.J. Abrams. It's actually called Star Wars Episode 9 Duel of the Fates. And while it's not perfect, it's still a hell of a lot better than what we got in the end. If you haven't already listened to it, I highly suggest you do. It's absolutely amazing. I definitely recommend it for anybody who wants the true Episode 9, unlike what we got. I'll have it linked in the description below. On top of all of what I just mentioned, The Force Awakens, while it is flawed in some areas, it still proved that the franchise can still stand on top while competing with many other film franchises out there. While the latter 2 films of the sequel trilogy pretty much tarnished its film reputation for good. That is until now, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. So, in conclusion, I made some changes to my favorite 3 Star Wars films of all time by taking out The Rise of Skywalker and putting The Force Awakens in its place. Well, yeah, there are some elements that its successors has. It's way more Star Wars-like than any of The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker. So, with that said, my favorite 3 Star Wars films are Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, both the original and also its Supercut, which I will have linked in the description, both the Google Drive and the content creator's YouTube channel and Discord as well. Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. Like Revenge of the Sith, there was also a Supercut, however, I made it like the previous, I will have the Google Drive linked in the description below. And also, Episode 7, The Force Awakens. It was definitely worth it when I saw it in theaters, and it still is now. And it's definitely way better than the other two, and almost as good as the podcast version of Episode 9, rather than that inferior movie version. As for Episodes 8 and 9, I just recommend just staying away from it altogether. Like, you could say, a galaxy far, far away from it. However, I will say this. Now that we've heard the latest announcement from Disney Investor Day of what's going to happen for the future of the franchise, especially in terms of content like all the upcoming series for Disney Plus, I can safely say, at least with some cautious optimism, that maybe, just maybe, we can finally get a lot of better content than what we got from the sequel trilogy. In fact, even film is getting a big boost as well by hiring Wonder Woman director Patty Jenkins to take the helm of Rogue Squadron. Even better yet, Kathleen Kennedy has now been dropped from the franchise, and it looks to be that Jon Favreau is going to take over, which seems like a pretty good choice if you ask me, based on what he's done for both The Mandalorian and how he laid out the groundwork for the MCU. So, based on that, this could be an actual fresh start that the franchise really needs. In fact, I could almost see this being even better than what we got from before, if not almost on par from the first 6. So, consider me intrigued. So anyways, that's all I have to say about the sequel trilogy. Let me know what you guys think. Please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later.